Good morning and welcome to the 32nd meeting in 2025 of the Local Government Housing and Planning Committee. And I remind all members and witnesses to ensure that their devices are on silent. Willie Coffey and Fulton McGregor are joining us online this morning, and we've received apologies from Megan Gallagher. And the first item on our agenda is to decide whether to take item 3 in private. Are members agreed? Thank you. We are all agreed. The next item on our agenda is to take evidence from the Scottish Housing Regulator, and we're joined today by Gary Coutts, who's the Chair, and Michael Cameron, who's the Chief Executive. And I welcome both Gary and Michael to the meeting. And there's no need for you to turn your microphones on or off, as we'll do that for you. And I'd like to begin by inviting Gary to give a brief opening statement.
Thank you very much, Convener, and thank you and committee, and thanks for inviting us to present our annual report and accounts for 24-25. As you're aware, this is my first committee evidence session as chair of the SHR, and so I'll be keeping my opening remarks brief to give as much opportunity for discussion and questions as possible. But I thought I'd maybe start off by just saying a little bit about my first impressions having joined the organisation. I'm delighted that SHR has a diverse board with members who are tenants. They've worked within as professionals within the sector and have served on RSL boards of management. And they have a wide range of appropriate skills and knowledge to ensure effective governance of the organisation. With myself joining as well, I was a local authority member and chaired the housing committee for a period of time as well. So that expands the experience as well. And we've just appointed a new member who has got extensive audit as well as having been on the board of an RSL committee herself. I was very impressed when I first met the board that they shared my objective, which is to ensure that this organisation is open, transparent, and genuinely listens to and responds to all of our stakeholders. And I'm delighted that they are sharing that ambition for the organisation. I've also really appreciated the opportunity to meet with yourself, Convener, and with the clerk back in October. And like the rest of the SHR board and staff team, I very much value the important scrutiny work the committee undertakes. Can I also thank you for the letter that you gave to us and our opportunity to respond. And I hope you found that, as well as the correspondence with our stakeholders, useful. I know you'll have questions about our work, so I'll just very briefly touch on a few topics that have been important to us in the last year. Our annual report on the Social Housing Charter, which we published in August, highlights that despite a difficult environment, social landlords have maintained or improved performance against most of the Charter outcomes and standards. This includes areas that matter most to tenants, such as housing quality, the levels of housing quality increasing, tenant satisfaction improving, and landlords achieving quicker response times for emergency repairs. We've also reported that at the aggregate level, the financial health of registered social landlords remains strong, although we are seeing finances tightening for some. There are 3 key areas which bring challenges for social landlords that we're currently focusing on, and the first of those will be no surprise, and that will be homelessness. Scotland, as we all know, continues to face a serious challenge in the provision of homelessness services. Demand for homes far exceeds supply, which impacts on councils' ability to meet their statutory duties. We have assessed 3 councils as being impacted by systemic failure, and 7 more are at risk of falling into that category. This sits alongside the national housing emergency declared by the Scottish Parliament and local emergencies declared by 13 councils. Systemic failure demands a systemic response. Long term, that means prevention of homelessness, but also building more homes. But most urgently, we need more capacity, especially more suitable temporary accommodation. And we've been engaging with the Scottish Government around this issue. From a regulatory perspective, we must work within our legislative power and duties, and these don't allow us to act on the wider housing system. We will keep monitoring councils, promoting improvement and working with the government and others to tackle these acute issues in homelessness. Second big issue for us is tenant and resident safety. We continue to keep a strong focus on the range of issues that affect this. Some landlords are facing challenges, meeting electrical and fire safety obligations, for example, or dealing with issues like cladding and falling stonework. We've published data on RAC and are working with social landlords on management plans where RAC is present. We're also collaborating with the Scottish Government and stakeholders on actions following the Grenfell Inquiry Phase 2 report and on what information is needed next. We've introduced new indicators on damp and mould to help us monitor landlords' achievement for the Social Housing Charter. We'll first collect the new indicators in the annual return on the Charter. Landlords will give us by next year. Then we'll review the effectiveness of these new indicators with a particular eye on whether they meet the reporting requirements for the new legal requirements on social landlords introduced by the Housing Scotland Act 2025. And thirdly, I just wanted to say a little bit about the continued challenges facing tenants. Our engagement with tenants and our research with the National Panel of Tenants and Residents shows that many tenants continue to face real financial difficulties. At the same time, landlords are under pressure. Rising costs, high interest rates and the investment needed to maintain homes and meet net zero targets, etc., all while managing supply chain challenges, really do ultimately impact on rent levels. Social landlords have started the process of consulting tenants on rent increases for next April, and we're starting to see proposed increases ranging from 7 to 12%. Finally, can I just say I understand that this committee will be dissolved and new committees formed after the elections in May. And can I just thank the committee for the engagement you've had with SHR and wish all members the very best for the future. And can you also be assured that we will remain committed to working closely with the new committee responsible for our scrutiny. Thanks.
Thanks very much for that. Yes, I'm sure there will be an element around the Scottish Housing Regulator that will go in our legacy report. We'll be passing on information there. And I think it has been a good thing this session that we've done a deeper dive. It's been useful for committee members to get to know your work and talk to others about it rather than just purely take the yourself and the Chief Exec Michael coming to give a report. So a report on the report. So I think it's been an enriching experience to go that bit deeper. And it was good to see here the three key areas that you've highlighted around homelessness, tenant and resident safety, and also the challenges facing tenants there. I would be interested to get an update from you on a bit more detail on what the SHR, Scottish Housing Regulator, has done to improve communications and relationships with all its stakeholders. I know we've been having that dialogue, but it'd be good to hear a bit more.
When I joined the organisation, both the current existing directors and indeed the executive all pointed to the evidence sessions that you collected last year and the letter that you'd sent. And I was really impressed that they were all looking and reflecting strongly on how we did engage and how we would improve the quality of the engagement as we go forward. That's something which I believe we've got to continuously do. It's not just something you do once and forget about. It's something that we must reflect on fully. And we have been increasing the opportunities for all of our stakeholders to be able to engage with us. And we're going to develop that. I'll ask Michael to comment on some of the numbers around the specific engagements we've had. But one of the things that I'm particularly keen to promote is opportunities for board members to meet face-to-face with people who are either on boards of management of RSLs, executives, and with tenants and people who use the services, so that we can hear informally from them about how the engagement with the regulator is going and look to improve that. So a couple of examples are that we're going to be introducing informal visits to social landlords, and we've asked the Federation to organise those for us so that we are not selecting which landlords it is we visit. It will be selected by the sector itself. And we'll have some specific meetings with groups. So, for example, we'll be convening a meeting with the existing cooperatives in Scotland, because there will be some specific issues that they will have concerns with, and we'll want to sort of have a bit of a dive in with those. So, yeah, it's an active issue. It's one that we have discussed and will continue to discuss. Early in the new year, we'll be having a review of our communication strategy, and this will form a major part of the discussion that will be taking place then. Michael, do you want to say just a little bit about some of the numbers of engagement that we've...
Sure, and we've set out the detail of this in our submission to you, so happy to pick up on anything specific within that. Some stuff to highlight, perhaps. In terms of our work as a regulator, obviously we come into contact with those bodies that we regulate, and this year we've had direct engagement with 78 RSLs and all 32 local authorities. So we're having face-to-face contact with over 60% of all social landlords. We have a number of ways in which we have standing engagement with landlords and their representative bodies to ensure that we are understanding from them the challenges they face, the issues that might arise in their daily work. So we have 3 standing groups of landlords, one which is focused on rural and island landlords, one which is focused on urban landlords, and one which is a not particularly appealing title of systemically important landlords. These are larger landlords who are significant developers or have, in effect, the only social landlord presence in a particular area. Together, all of those groups mean that we have regular engagement with around about 45 RSLs. We also have regular meetings with the Chief Executive and Chair of the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations. I meet with the Chief Executive on a monthly basis to discuss issues and understand concerns that may be arising through his engagement with his members. And we have a range of other ways in which we engage through existing forums, through attendance at conferences, where we are looking to ensure that our people are able to have direct engagement with those that they regulate, out with of a regulatory setting.
Okay, thanks for that. The standing groups or forums, I think, was that something that you were, that's fairly new initiative that you've brought in?
We started this just over 3 years ago, but what we will be looking to do early in the new year is to look to expand those groups. We regularly get notes of interest from other landlords who'd be keen to participate in those discussions. So we will look to see how we can ensure that more landlords are able to participate in those groups, either through expanding the groups as they are or by putting in place further groups that might be focused on different types of landlord.
What's the motivation for people wanting to get involved in those groups when they come and say, we'd like to be involved? What's the...
I think it's an opportunity to have discussions about some of the big issues that are there in social housing in Scotland, without it being a one-to-one regulatory engagement. So it's an opportunity for them to hear from us what we see at that national level, and that perspective that we can bring to some of the issues that are in play in social housing. But it's also a great opportunity for us and for them to give us the sense of how it is when they're operating on the front line. So certainly all of the members of those groups have expressed a real appetite to continue working with us in those groups, hence the appetite to expand the membership rather than necessarily to rotate it.
Is it also an opportunity, for example, with the rural and island or the urban, to actually kind of share ideas, or we've got this challenge, oh, we're approaching it this way, so kind of a bit of a sharing of information and approaches? Absolutely.
Within the group, there's some sharing of experiences and sharing of different initiatives. What that also does, it gives us an opportunity to gather up that kind of information, play that back into other forums that we are participating in, including things like the Housing to 2040 Strategy Board. And we will regularly feed back to Scottish Government colleagues some of the information that's coming through those groups for landlords, including what the issues are that they are experiencing, but also, as you're highlighting, possible different ways of tackling some of the challenges that are out there.
Right. Okay. That sounds very constructive. I just want to touch in a bit on a more specific issue around the transfer of engagement, the TOE process, and how your discussions are going with GWSF on the community, on how community interests can best be taken account of during that process.
Yeah. We've had a number of conversations with the forum around this issue, and they are developing guidance for their members. As I understand it, that guidance will be available for their members fairly shortly. We've had, I think it was last month, a really constructive discussion with the forum around that guidance, and they were willing to take on a number of hopefully constructive comments that we had made on that guidance. So that hopefully will be available potentially before Christmas, but certainly early into the new year.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to bring in Evelyn Tweed with a number of questions.
Convener, and good morning, gentlemen. Thank you for being with us today. In your recent letter, you describe informal engagement. I know this can include directing committees to appoint quotees or consultants against their wishes, or to remove board members, as occurred at Dalmuir Park. Associations are effectively forced to comply or face statutory supervision. This appears to circumvent the safeguards built into formal statutory intervention. Where in the Housing Scotland Act 2010 does the Scottish Housing Regulator have authority to direct RSLs in this way outside the formal intervention framework?
Yeah, there is no authority in the Housing 2010 Act around that. We operate on the basis of the statutory powers that are in that Act. We don't direct RSLs to do anything. We can work constructively with that, RSLs, and we do that on a daily basis to support them to ensure that they have the right skills, potentially around their board tables or committee tables, or in their management teams. And that's done on a basis of voluntary engagement, which is our normal method of working. And I think if you were to engage with the representative bodies or individual RSLs, I would be fairly confident that you would get back that that's a constructive approach and that they value our engagement in that way.
So you don't have any formal authority to work in this way. So how do you demonstrate that such informal actions are transparent? Where do you discuss how you are interacting with organisations in this way transparently?
In terms of transparency, all of our engagement with every single social landlord is set out in our engagement plans, which we publish on an annual basis and review on an annual basis. We will also, if we engage directly with a landlord, we will provide them with the outcome of that engagement in writing, and that's our normal method of operating.
And those engagement plans are seen by the board, and the updates on those where there's active engagement because of particular issues at the time, we see the updates on those. So that level of engagement is scrutinised by the board.
So can I ask, in the plans that you refer to, do you go through the process of how you have delved into that informal engagement? Is that stated within those plans?
We set out the nature of the engagement that we have. We set out what we would expect the landlord to provide to us, and we would set out what actions we would take. So that would all be contained within the relevant engagement plan.
because I think going forward it would be interesting to see the transparency of those transactions in the detail. But maybe that's something that we can think about further.
It's certainly something which is available, and if the committee or your successor has any concerns about the level of information that is being made in those plans and that's published, then we'd be happy to review that.
Thanks for that. I'll go on to my next question. Reedvale Housing Association is now fully compliant with regulatory standards, which is great news. Yet a few months ago, the regulator pushed for a merger with an England-based housing association. Community action and not regulatory judgment has stopped the transfer. In 2022, the Glasgow and West of Scotland Forum warned that governing bodies can be unduly influenced by those close to the regulator and promoting transfers. Looking at the 16 or so associations that have been merged under Scottish Housing Regulator oversight over the past decade, how many do you now consider could have been saved with proper support from the regulator?
I'll pick up on the issues around Reedvale in the first instance and come back to the issue of transfers.
Yeah, sure.
It's worth pointing out that Reedvale, while we had engagement with Reedvale, we did not use our statutory powers in Reedvale at any point. And Reedvale has now provided us with sufficient assurance to enable us to say that they now are a landlord that complies with regulatory requirements. It possibly would be worth pointing out that in the Reedvale press release last week that was issued when we issued our engagement plan, the chief executive or the interim director of Reedvale said they were grateful to the regulator for its constructive engagement and for recognising the significant distance the organisation has travelled.
I think on the issue of how many could be how many might have been able to have stayed independent without having to have had a transfer, there's no doubt at all that if enough resources are made available, then any organisation could have carried on. But it was the decisions were made in the past based on the circumstances at the time and what was the available options. But Michael, you might have more information on that.
Yeah, possibly the first thing to say that is in terms of transfers, there's a number of different ways in which transfers happen. There's, if you like, a primary transfer of engagements or assets where the homes of the transferring RSL transfer to the receiving RSL, and then the transferring RSL effectively ceases to be and is deregistered. We also have the forming of constitutional partnerships where the transferring RSL will become a subsidiary of the receiving RSL, but will remain as a separate RSL registered with us. And then there's secondary transfer of engagements where an RSL, which is a subsidiary of another RSL, transfers its homes to that RSL or another part of the group structure. So there's a number of different ways in which such transfers can happen. Since the 2010 Act has been implemented, there's been 17 of those primary transfer of engagements, there's been 12 constitutional partnerships, and there's been 9 secondary transfer of engagements. And of those 9, a number of them will have been secondary to those constitutional partnerships that I touched on. So there's been quite an extensive number of transfers that have happened, and not all of these have any engagement with the regulator. Indeed, in terms of use of our statutory powers, we've only been involved in directing the transfer of 2 organisations out of that full number.
I think going back to my previous question about the informal engagement, I think transparency on that and how to do a deep dive into how the regulator can really support organisations in that phase when you go in to help them would be interesting to see how you can provide better support. And I think that's maybe something that needs to be looked at. Moving on to my next question, admittance to the regulator's approved consultants list requires interim management experience. This creates a catch-22. Candidates cannot gain this experience unless they're already on the list. This excludes senior Scottish housing professionals with long-term leadership experience. Will the regulator commit to opening the list to those with proven long-term leadership to address perceptions that it favours a narrow group of consultants that promote mergers?
Every 3 years, we undertake an exercise to open the list and to ask anyone who is interested to come forward. We do have criteria that we set out, and we publish that criteria. It's there. It's part of the open and transparent process for establishing the list. We will, of course, consider when we next review the list, which I think will be next year. We will, of course, consider whether we need to look at that criteria that is set out to ensure that we have appropriately skilled and qualified and experienced people available to us should we require to make use of anyone on that list. We haven't done so for about 6 years, so I think the next review of the list will be an important one.
Thanks for that, Mr Cameron. So you agree that the list needs an overhaul and it needs a good look at how it's put together?
We do that every 3 years. We review the list. We open it out to anyone who wants to come forward, and we construct a list from those who have come forward.
Okay, thank you. To move on to my next question, the regulator approved consultants charge up to £1,200 per day plus expenses and VAT, yet some hold little or no higher level qualifications and qualify solely through Scottish Housing Regulator interim roles. These fees far exceed those for other public appointments. For example, the legally qualified tribunal members receive around £500 a day, and the Scottish Housing Regulator Chair only receives £229 per day. Will the regulator commit to aligning consultants' fees with other public appointments, recognising that tenants fund these? And given there is a perception that interventions destroy rather than save organisations?
I think we need to recognise there's a very significant difference in responsibilities for somebody that's appointed on different bases. As a non-executive chair of an organisation, I hold no executive authority at all, and my role is very, very different from the type of appointment that is made under the terms that we would act on, but making sure that we're getting value for money and is aligned with the appropriate levels is something that the board will scrutinise. But Michael, do you want to say anything about the levels that we have just now?
Yes, and they vary, the levels of those who are currently on the list in terms of their day rates. We are very mindful of the cost to RSLs, our local authorities. The legislation requires that it's those bodies that make the payments to statutory appointees. And there is a question as to whether there are different mechanisms that that Parliament might want to consider in terms of the funding of that, given that it is ultimately tenants who meet those costs. We haven't used anyone from our statutory list in the last 6 years. So there haven't been any of those direct costs as a result of statutory intervention for some time. We will always make sure that statutory intervention is used as the last resort, not least because of the potential impact on tenants and costs.
I take Mr Coote's point about what you said. However, I do think there needs to be a review of who's taken onto the list, their qualifications, what they've done in the past. Because surely there needs to be some reason for them being on the list, rather than they have just, you know, worked for the regulator in the past in some capacity. I think that needs a deeper dive into it, especially given the level of fees that are being charged in comparison to the rest of the public sector.
And we set out on our website the criteria that we use to select the statutory managers, and that sets out all the qualifications and experience requirements that we look for.
And I'm quite happy to give an undertaking that, as there is a scheduled review this year, as there was 3 years ago, that the board will have eyes on that, and we certainly have heard comments that you're making, and issues of affordability and getting best value are ones that I will take back to the board, and as we're scrutinising that plan for the review, I will make sure that that's reflected in the discussions at the board.
That's good, Mr Coutson. I look forward to seeing that. And my last question, can you give us further information about the purpose of the planned forthcoming meeting with RSLs that are cooperatives?
Yeah, it's an issue that was raised actually with the meeting with the convener, and also in light of the amendments that had been tabled but were not accepted as the bill was going through the parliamentary process, that it certainly dawned on me that there is a small group of RSLs or cooperatives that we weren't otherwise engaging with, that they are different. I've got a particular affection for co-ops. I was involved in the creation of Hunters Hall Co-op in Edinburgh going back into the 90s. So I've got a real affection for them, and I certainly was very keen that we would gather this small group together just to hear about their individual experiences, but also if there was something of common interest that the regulator was creating any issues around in terms of their governance. I think there is stuff that we have to discuss, and I think there will be issues that we'll have to bring back to government to ensure that the particularly small cooperatives will be able to continue to flourish into the future. There are particular issues around where they can recruit their members of their management committees from, which does make it more difficult for them to get the range of skills and experience around their board table that are required. So I think it'd be useful to have that discussion, and we're delighted to do it, and I'd be very happy to invite the convener or any other members of the committee that want to attend to come along to that meeting as well, to hear what they have to say.
Okay, great, thanks very much. I'm going to move on to questions from Alexander Stewart.
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, gentlemen. In light of the increases on inflation, and that's having a pressure on staff salaries and other ongoing costs, it would be good to get a flavour of how you are managing your budget and what you see as any of the short or medium term issues that you may need to address to try and tackle some of those inflationary and additional costs that you're having to bear.
Okay. As you'll know from our report, that last year we came in on budget, and this year we will be coming in on budget as well. I can give you assurances of that. In fact, in both last year and this year, we will be returning elements of our the resources that were available to us back to Scottish Government. So there's very small amounts, I have to say, but we will be returning some. The organisation, again, I'm relatively new, but I've been very impressed with the amount of reductions in outgoings that they've had. The amount of savings that they've made in relation to office costs is very, very significant, a huge reduction there. They're an organisation that is absolutely committed to sharing services wherever possible, and they take the full suite of shared services from the Scottish Government, and that helps to drive down our costs considerably. There is now becoming a real pressure on the organisation that we have held vacancies to help manage the budget, We don't know what our settlement for next year will be, and we can assume that it's not going to be a massive amount of growth. So we'll just plan for being almost flat cash and see what happens. And on that basis, we will have to continue to hold vacancies, and that will restrict the amount of work that we can do going forward. Even with the use of AI and trying to become as efficient as we possibly can, we are likely to have to target more of our regulation on the areas that we identify that are higher risk, rather than doing it across the whole of the sector. And we will also have to curtail some of the specific reviews that we've done in the past around different themes, the thematic reviews that we've done. We don't really have the capacity to be able to do those in the future. Again, we will choose to make sure that the ones that will carry the biggest risks are the ones that we'll go ahead with. But as an organisation, it's absolutely focused on ensuring that it does meet its budgetary requirements and is as efficient as it possibly can be. And I think it's proved itself to be a good and prudent organisation in the past, and it will be going forward. Michael, do you want to add any specifics?
No, I think you've covered everything. I think the challenge will come in the next 2 or 3 years. I think that's a challenge which we recognise is across the entire public sector, and not just for us. We will continue to look for ways to be as efficient as we possibly can. But as Gary has set out, we have been working hard over the last few years to try and ensure that we are as lean as we possibly can be, and so we don't have an awful lot more that we can look to in terms of savings, other than the potential need for us to look to reduce what it is we actually deliver.
And you know, when we talk about best value and public service reform agendas, how are you managing to contribute to some of that? Because if you've already identified this morning, you can't cover everything. You need to potentially cherry pick some of the areas you believe that are the most severe risk to the organisation and to what you need to achieve. So in trying to encapsulate these reforms and what you see yourself as the regulator doing going forward, how do you manage to square that circle to ensure that you do manage to fulfil your requirements and your obligations, but also trying to ensure that the funding is levelled and that you do, at the end of the day, see some best value and some public service reforms within the organisation?
I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. It's about constantly looking at the landscape that's ahead of us and where the priorities are going to be. I think one of the things that's impressed me is that there's a really, really good relationship between the regulator and the people that we regulate, and the quality of the data that we get in from them is absolutely first class. So that gives us the opportunity to scrutinise that data and then prioritise which organisations might be at most risk or which areas of work across the sector are at most risk. And I think that work has, speaking to the people that are involved in it and have been for a while, that work is getting more sophisticated and is becoming better and better. In terms of the wider best value and efficient government agenda, I mean, we share premises. We don't have our own premises anymore. We also do things like we share our data protection officer with Transport Scotland. We would not be able to, we need one, but we would not be able to have that as a standalone organisation at our size. And we're looking to work with colleagues across the whole of the public sector where it is efficient and practical to do so, to share responsibilities and work where there's some overlap in our work. So it's a moving feast, and it's one that the board will continuously examine as we're looking at operational plans and the risk register going forward as to where we're putting our resources. Michael, do you want to?
Yeah, we engage regularly with colleagues and other public bodies. As Gary says, I'm a member of the Scottish Delivery Bodies Group, which brings together chief executives of all public bodies. And we are continuously looking for opportunities to share services, to look for ways to create efficiencies, but also to look at how we might be able to ensure we're working in ways that help to deliver the right outcomes, with a very particular eye to the National Performance Framework in that regard. As Gary has said, we have worked hard over the last 5, 6, 7 years to be as lean as we possibly can, and we've stripped out significant costs from the organisation. We're now in a place where nearly 90% of our cost is for staff. So if we are looking at having to find further savings, it's almost inevitably going to mean that we have to look at our staff costs. And we're a people business. It's people that deliver the work that we do. So if we have fewer people, then obviously we will not be able to do as much work or the work that we currently do in the same way. We will, Gary mentioned AI, and we'll be exploring opportunities there. I think it's safe to say we've not gone further than exploring opportunities at this point, but we will consider all options available to ensure that we continue to be an effective regulator, even if we are faced with these financial challenges.
I think it is worthwhile pointing out that since the organisation was created, we currently have about 25% fewer headcount than we did when it was first started. So, and it's not a zero-sum game. As more regulatory responsibilities are passed on to us, then there is a demand there, and it becomes even more difficult to pick which areas it is that you want to really scrutinise.
Thank you, Convener.
Thanks very much. I'm just curious. Michael, you said you're exploring AI opportunities. Would you say a bit more about what areas you could see that being applied?
Yeah, there are a number of processes and procedures that we will use, and which every organisation will use, and there's opportunities to look at whether AI can streamline some of that and do some of that kind of heavy lifting admin activity. So we're exploring that. There's also, we do a lot of analytical work, and there is the potential for AI to undertake some of that analytical work for us, thereby freeing up our people to do the direct engagement activity, and potentially to pick up on those types of areas of work that we know that stakeholders value, such as our thematic studies. So it's very much within the boundaries of Scottish Government current position around the use of AI, and the Scottish Government itself is undertaking a pilot which we are participating in to understand just how applicable AI could be to some of our activities, while ensuring data safety and accuracy of output, etc.
Yeah, interesting to just hear that. We're going to change themes. I'm going to move on to get into a bit more around what, Gary, you were talking about as one of the key challenges, the key areas that you've been focusing on. So it's around the key challenges facing RSLs and councils, tenants and service users, and the general level of performance. And I'm going to bring in Willie Coffey, who's joining us online with a number of questions in that area. Willie.
Thanks very much, Convener, and good morning, Gary and Michael. Welcome to the committee. My apologies for not being there. I wanted to pick up on 2 or 3 issues that the Convener mentioned there, some of which you've mentioned in your opening remarks, Gary, as well. But firstly, on the issue about rent and affordability, what kind of signs are you picking up in terms of the impact this is having on tenants? Are RSL still providing value for money? Are you seeing any evidence of tenants being put under severe pressure and perhaps becoming homeless because of these issues? So maybe a little bit more of a flavour from you on what the impacts are in that area, please. Thank you.
With RSLs and with tenants' representatives, that it's undoubtedly an issue that's at the forefront of people's minds. There's no doubt at all that many issues such as improvements that are required to housing, managing to meet the standards in relation to emergency repairs and repairs generally, and the increase in staff costs and inflation that we're seeing is putting pressure on RSLs and indeed local authorities to and that will be reflected in rent rises in the future. We do not get involved in rent setting, but what we do make sure is that RSLs, or what we do scrutinise is that RSLs all social landlords are engaging effectively with their tenants around rent setting. One of the things that we have picked up and will want to do over the next year is to refresh the way that we actually look at that type of scrutiny of how RSLs are engaging and ensure that it is effective and meaningful engagement that is taking place. So that's a piece of work that we'll be picking up in the future. I think Michael will have more details in front of him, but in terms of things like looking at rent arrears figures and how that's impacting, and evictions around because of the impact of rents will be one of the indicators that we'll look at. But certainly when you're seeing 7 to 12% rent increases being floated at the moment, it is going to be a very, very significant issue in the coming year.
Absolutely.
Michael.
Yeah, it's maybe worth just flagging that every year we undertake work through the National Panel of Tenants and Service Users, around about 500 tenants and service users that participate in that. And an important area of work over the last 5 years, we've asked consistent questions around this, is about the impact on them of the financial challenges that they're experiencing. And we set out in the published reports on the national panel extensive information about what that is looking like for tenants. And for example, we found that in those that responded, around about 20% were saying that they were not managing well financially, and that a further 4% were in real financial difficulty, and that the concerns about their finances were the principal issue for about 3/4 of those that participate in the survey. It's probably worth pointing out that that's about whole household finances, not specific to rent, and indeed quite often what comes through is that the bigger concern for many of those respondents was around fuel costs and some of these other household costs rather than necessarily rent. Last year, social landlords increased their rent by on average 6.4%, but that does follow on from a period where most landlords kept their rents below inflation, and indeed a number had a period of rent freezing in recognition of those kind of challenges that tenants were experiencing. Gary mentioned arrears, and it is a useful indicator to look at to see whether that pressure is building there. In fact, last year, in terms of the information we published in the summer, at an aggregate level, rent arrears in social housing in Scotland went down from, I think it was 6.7% down to 6.2%. So suggesting that, that at least for some tenants, they're able to manage the position around their rent, even while experiencing those wider financial challenges. I think that's also certainly from the work that we do and we see landlords undertaking, a testament to their interventions in helping tenants to sustain their homes through a range of different activities, not just direct housing management activities.
Thanks for that, Michael. Would you be able to focus in on, do you think, whether there is a causal link from, say, rent level rises and homelessness? I know you've said it's a there's a wide range of other issues that are related to these issues. But is that something you might be able to track at all, so that if somebody, one of the members of this committee in the future, said to you, how many people became homeless as a result of rent rises that they just could no longer afford to pay, would that be something you think you might be able to track using your AI tools of the future?
It's certainly something that we look at in terms of the information we get from landlords and indeed from the Scottish Government around rent levels, level of rent arrears, the reasons that landlords raise court actions against their tenants, and the number of those court actions that can result in evictions. And I'd be happy to provide the committee with an analysis of that. We have that data. We consider it in our scrutiny of individual landlords. So I'll have a look at what we might be able to bring back. Whether we're always able to identify exactly whether a specific eviction then resulted in a specific application for homelessness is, but I think if we look at the patterns in the data, they may be able to suggest that. My immediate kind of instinct in that is that there may be more of a causal link in that regard in the private rented sector than there is in the social rented sector. Social landlords work hard to sustain tenancies. They work hard to ensure that their tenants receive advice and support if they're experiencing financial challenges. So it would, and I certainly don't have the data around the private rented sector, but it would also be interesting to see whether there's an obvious and significant difference between the two sectors.
That's really helpful, Michael. Thanks. I'm sure the committee will appreciate anything that you can give us as a follow-up. On the big issue about homelessness, Gary, you mentioned in your opening remarks that 3 of the councils are experiencing systemic failure in this regard, and there's another 7 councils at risk. I'm not going to ask you to name many councils, but probably to ask you what kind of action are the councils taking, what kind of help are they getting, and are they getting through this problem in any way to try and resolve that situation?
The term systemic failure basically means that it's beyond the ability of a single local authority to be able to take action itself, and it requires all partners within the society basically to be able to contribute what they can to be able to help within that. But that's not to be taken as a sort of a get-out-of-jail-free card for those authorities. We need to make sure that they are using absolute best practice in terms of trying to sustain tenancies rather than people drifting in and out of homelessness, as we've seen happen on numerous occasions. It's also about making sure that houses are available for let as quickly as possible after they've been vacated. It's about making sure that any hard-to-let houses are brought back into the system as quickly as possible, and our engagement with local authorities and RSLs on those areas is all critical, a critical part of it. Michael engages with the Scottish Government in relation to the Housing 2040 working group. So it's looking at the way that the investment can be made most effective for achieving the sort of increase in housing that we need to be able to get over the coming years. And one of the other things that we do is that through our regulation, the lenders to RSLs are comfortable with the level of risk that is there and are still very willing to lend. So RSLs have got access to borrowing to try and increase the amount of stock that we can get there. And there's not going to be a single solution to homelessness. It's about dozens of different threads all being pulled together to make sure that we can achieve the sort of the reduction in homelessness that we want. But Michael, do you want to say a little bit more?
Perhaps just to pick up on some of the wider work that's going on. I participate in the Scottish Government's Housing to 2040 Strategy Board, and at the last meeting in November I led a discussion around possible ways to address the significant challenges that local authorities are experiencing around the supply of suitable temporary accommodation. That's where we're seeing the most acute need at the moment, both in terms of local authorities not being able to provide temporary accommodation at all in instances, but also people having to be placed in what would be categorised as unsuitable temporary accommodation. So that discussion, there were a number of follow-throughs from that, which hopefully might start to bear some fruit in terms of a potential increase in the supply of suitable temporary accommodation. That forum is an opportunity to bring relevant people together to try and identify action-based solutions to some of these challenges. But I think, as Gary has said, it's not an easy fix, and I suspect it's also not going to be a quick fix. There is the fundamental need to increase the supply of available accommodation across the piece, and also the work around preventing homelessness will be critical. So it's about reducing the demand through prevention, but also ensuring we have an adequate supply of homes to ensure that we are able to provide people with the accommodation that they need when they need it.
Thank you. Do you think the councils, not necessarily the 3 or the 7 that you mentioned earlier, are the councils doing enough to get their void stock back into use? Because that was one of the big issues that we heard about some time ago at the committee, that a lot of Scottish councils have quite a number of void stock, and I think Edinburgh in particular did some great work in bringing a lot of their stock back into use. So are you getting anything of a picture of whether the councils across Scotland are doing more and perform better in bringing void stock back into use?
Yeah, we've seen a number of initiatives undertaken by particularly local authorities to look at accelerating the time it takes to bring homes back into use, but also looking at stock which would perhaps have been set aside for various reasons, whether it's to look at demolition or to consider major renovation projects, and looking at opportunities to advance those back in. We've seen that having a bit of an impact in the statistics this year. However, the challenge there is that's likely to be a one-off hit. Once those properties are back in use, they're back in use, and you won't be able to bring them, look to that resource again. In many ways, the bigger concern that certainly we have is a trend that we've seen over the last few years of reducing turnover in social housing. Now, that could be for very positive reasons, in that people are sustaining their tenancies, are content with the homes that they're in. But whatever the cause of that is, it means that there are fewer homes becoming available to let to people who are in need. And that takes us back to where Gary touched on the need for an increase in the overall supply of temporary of accommodation, and within that, temporary accommodation too.
Okay, thanks for that, Michael. My last question for you, it's just about overall performance and quality of housing. And again, Gary, you told us that some positive indicators from tenants and so on about their response to improvement times, response times for repairs and so on and so forth. You talked about the cladding and the rack issue, and you mentioned the dampness and mould and new indicators that will come into play there. As we all know, AWAB's law will be coming into force, I think, next March, and it's just to ask you, what are the implications for you as the regulator, do you think, on keeping an eye on, let's say, on whether the landlords are fully implementing the government's wishes in respect of AWAB's law and with respect to dampness and mould issues in the stock that we know is there and needs to improve? So what additional burden might that bring the regulator in terms of monitoring and reporting on that?
We've already included questions to social landlords about dampness and mould, which we will get their responses to early in the first quarter of the new year. that will give us a chance to see whether we're asking the right questions, is it giving us the information that we really need, and whether we have to tweak the approach that we have. So that's already in hand. Around some of the other regulatory requirements that are included in the 25 Act, then we'll still have to think about that. So there'll be things like, for example, once the requirements for net zero come along, that will have an impact on RSLs, and it will also need for us to be able to monitor people's implementation of the requirements. So it's still a bit of a moving feast that we don't have all the answers to as yet, but certainly in relation to damp and mould, and certainly in relation to things like RAC and cladding, we have been working with the government to help provide the information that they require to make the assessments of what sort of funding will be required for remediation. But Michael, do you want to add in?
Yeah, and I think the indicators that we've included in the annual return on the Charter for this current reporting year may very well be suitable and adequate for monitoring the new legislative requirements that will be introduced in, I think the Scottish Government is aiming for March for that introduction. But we will look at that, as Gary said, and we'll consider whether they deliver what we need as a regulator and what other stakeholders, including Parliament, might need in terms of ensuring that there's an appropriate understanding of both the extent and the impact of any damp and mould in social housing. And it's probably worth flagging that in terms of general quality of home, we've seen tenant satisfaction around quality of home increase in the last year, very marginally, but it has increased. And also compliance with the Scottish Housing Quality Standard has increased in the last year. So both positive indicators of work that landlords have been doing to try and ensure that the homes they provide to tenant are meeting those appropriate standards.
Right, thanks for that. Just one final question on that, Michael and Gary, for me, on the damp and mould issue. I mean, I've come across this for many, many years as a local councillor and also as a member of the Parliament, and it always worried me that landlords, councils or otherwise could allocate a house to a person or a family knowing that the property, the house, was suffering from dampness and mould. Do you think that will still be possible, even with the AWAB's law coming in? Is it still going to be possible that landlords can allocate a house to a family, to a person that clearly is suffering from dampness and mould at the outset?
In fact, in terms of current standards and requirements, it shouldn't be the case that a house which has significant damp and mould is allocated, because it shouldn't meet the lettable standards that landlords are required to meet. So in those circumstances, it would certainly be the case that I would encourage any tenant to raise those issues with their landlord in the first instance, and then potentially to raise it beyond their landlord if required. It may very well be that in some cases there's work planned and the landlord is keen to ensure that the individual has a home, but I think in those should be exceptional, those kind of circumstances.
Okay, thanks for taking that question, Michael. Thanks very much, Convener. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Willie. I just wanted to, I'm going to ask a question about supply in a moment, but I just wanted to go back and pick up a few things from what Willie was pursuing there. So on that, his question around tracking how many people become homeless due to rent rises, you pointed out that potentially that's more likely to happen in the private rented sector. But I wonder about, do you track, or is there any tracking done of people who come out of homelessness into the social rented sector?
There is. And the key metric for that we would look to is tenancy sustainment. So landlords report to us on every year on how many of their tenancies that were allocated in the previous year have been sustained. And we also get that information by the source of the let, so whether it's through the homeless route or through a housing list route. So that information is available, and if the committee's interested in that, I could look to get some of that information too.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if we could extend it, so if you could track somebody who goes into a homeless situation from a private rented sector, comes into homeless, and then comes into the social rented sector, that way we'd get a bit of an interesting picture around what Willie's talking about, but just in general, that movement of people and whether if they're coming out of the private rented sector.
Yeah, I suspect at the moment those you would have data that it relates to somebody who is homeless and the reason for them being homeless and where they're coming from in terms of that. So we would have an understanding of how many people are leaving the private rented sector into homelessness. Yeah. I think what we wouldn't necessarily have is that tracking the linking of the data through into they have a home and have they sustained that home. That may be more challenging to look at. It would be something that we engage regularly with the Scottish Government around its collection of statistics on homelessness, something that we could perhaps raise with them.
I think it might be worth looking into that. The other thing is on the systemic failure, and that pointed out that that's not necessarily just within the, it's broader. It's a broader issue. And I wondered if so we've done quite a bit of work early on community planning partnerships, and I wondered if that's a space where the systemic failure is being addressed to some degree, that discussion, how can partners in the community planning partnership help that situation?
Yeah, I think the particular role for community planning partnerships may be enhanced with the new requirements that have been brought in through the Housing 25 Act, which is placing homelessness prevention duties on bodies that would be partners within the community planning partnership, and in particular the implementation of the Ask and Act duty. Yeah. So that's ultimately we will get to a better place around homelessness when we have demand for homes and supply in an equilibrium. And at the moment, demand is far exceeding supply. Yeah. One of the important ways to reduce demand is to prevent people coming homeless in the first place. Yeah. So I think that focus on prevention is probably a particularly important one for partners around those tables.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that. Just on, so you had mentioned that voids will only take us so far, and what we actually need is the building of new homes. And I would be interested to understand what your sense is of how RSLs are managing the risks involved in building new homes, and whether the response is sufficient to address the housing emergency.
RSLs have development plans in place which we scrutinise and monitor of it, but we are seeing fewer houses being built on an annual basis at the moment, and we do need to see that being increased considerably. So last year, for example, I think it was only about 80% of the target that were actually completed within the sector. So, yeah, there's got to be a refocus on how we get best value to ensure that we maximise the number of homes that are available for people in desperate need for housing. But Michael, you've got some more details on
that. So in every year, as Gary mentions, we get 5-year financial projections from all RSLs, and that allows us to look at what they're planning to do in terms of the provision of new homes. And they're planning to provide in the next 5 years around about 17,500 homes, new homes. However, that figure is 22% down on the same figure from last year's financial projections, and that in itself was down 13% on the previous years. So as you can see, we're building fewer homes than we had planned in previous years, and certainly likely to be fewer homes than is required. There's no statutory obligation on a social landlord to build homes. There are duties on landlords to invest and maintain their existing homes. So in a situation of real financial challenge, it's an entirely understandable business decision for a social landlord to decide to invest, use its resources to invest in the homes that it already has, and to be perhaps a little bit more wary about building new homes, notwithstanding the very real reality that we need new homes to be built. Part of the challenge, I think, is around the costs that landlords are experiencing. I was involved in the meeting of the Rural and Island Landlord Group last week, and there was some discussion around this, and one of the examples that was given was one of the island-based associations identified that the unit cost for building a new house had doubled in the last 6 years. So that illustrates the real challenge that there is in terms of being able to build the number of homes at the kind of cost base that we would traditionally have been expecting. Also highlighting real challenges around contractor availability, supply chain challenges, material costs. All of these are feature regularly in our discussions with social landlords.
Yeah. Just on that island example where the cost has doubled, is that within their envelope? Because we certainly heard when we did a rural and island housing piece of work a couple of years ago that compared to the mainland, building on the islands is actually 3 times the amount. So is it 3 times the amount and then it's doubled for them?
It's doubled for that particular landlord,
yeah.
and that's within the context of them working on an island.
Yeah.
So yes, they would in all likely have had higher unit costs to begin with, but they've seen them double already, in that 6-year period.
Do you think, I'm just curious about the, so Gary, I think you mentioned the 80%, so 80% of the target was completed in the last year, do you think there was any holding back because of the heat in buildings and kind of waiting to see what that was going to bring about for building in any way?
I think, as Michael said, that landlords are cautious in that they need to ensure the viability of their own enterprise, and there are costs that they know are coming down the track towards them, which are not quantifiable at the moment. So I think that will be putting an element of additional caution onto what they're doing. Also, a lot of the larger associations have almost reaching the capacity that they can invest using their existing stock as covenant. So there's some constraints there as well. And we do need to think creatively about how we can maximise the new build that's going to go ahead in the future. I think it's important that we also don't just focus on the social rented sector, and that we accept that to resolve the housing crisis in Scotland at the moment, it's going to be an all-sector response that is going to be required. So we need to really understand what's happening within the private sector, the private rented sector, as well as within RSLs. It's not all going to happen in the RSL sector to resolve this problem.
Thanks for that. And in terms of the RSL development plans and the conversation you were having with Willie Coffey there around standards, rack, cladding, damp and mould, and those are like, that's a historic situation, right? Houses were built with certain materials or in certain ways, not maybe suitable to Scotland's climate, and we end up with these problems. And I recognise that we are required to build within a building with building standards, but do you have any responsibility as a housing regulator to monitor the quality of new builds? Do you get involved in any of that to make sure that we're not creating, not building a lot of new housing that's then going to end up with bigger problems with damp and mould and things like that in the future?
No, our role does not extend to that. As you say, there's building standards in place, and local authorities have responsibilities around building control. In terms of social housing, it's certainly social housing that's funded through grant. There will be requirements set out by the grant provider, Scottish Government, and they will undertake a certain amount of monitoring of the completion of those to the standards that were set out, and that they are consistent with what's set out in the grant offer terms.
Okay,
In the
so
past, we did report on the development programmes and looked at good practice to make sure that individual RSLs would be able to follow good practice when they're looking at their development and make sure they've got the right skills and the right people for managing those development programmes. That was done, I think, probably about 7 years ago. It's one of the things that we've hoped to be able to renew, refresh, because there is going to have to be an increase in house building, and we need to make sure that the sector is able to respond. But getting the timing of that right and looking at what the government's own investment plans will be one of those factors to make sure that that work can be done and will be able to impact when the building is going to be taking place. But it is going to be important work.
yeah, it would seem to me that you could potentially provide an important feedback. You're like part of the feedback loop where you're kind of meeting with tenants, coming across tenants that have problems with housing. And I mean, I'm aware of housing that's built to building standards now that have problems. So it's something that I have concern. We've got this kind of like ambition to build a lot more housing, and are we going to end up with housing stock that's giving us problems and public health problems down the line?
There has been some issues raised with us fairly recently by social landlords expressing concern about the resourcing of building control in local authorities. Having said that, one of the messages that we would put out to all social landlords is that they have to ensure that they have their own quality controls in their development programmes, and that they shouldn't rely exclusively on local authority building control. So having that presence on site during construction is an important way to ensure quality.
Right, so like a clerk of works.
Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Exactly.
It's really important that we stress it. When I was involved in local government, there weren't buildings that were not continuously visited by building control officers to make sure that the work was going as was submitted and warranted. That is not happening now, and there's a much more reliance on certification by the developer. So if housing associations, I'm not saying they do, but if they were relying on the certification from local authorities without doing their own checks at various critical stages of the build, then there could be problems for the future. But that is something which I think the vast majority of RSLs are well aware of.
Yeah, okay, that was a useful thing. I think it's just really important to highlight as we continue to talk about the importance of building more. It needs to be houses that work for people. Yeah, I've got a question around our travelling community, and I'd be interested to hear from you what progress landlords that provide sites to people in the traveller community are making to ensure the sites meet national standards and traveller satisfaction improves.
I think we are seeing improvement. We're engaging with all of the landlords that provide Gypsy Traveller site. We've got 28 of them provided by social landlords. 2 of those are currently closed. One's partially opened whilst it's being rebuilt or under consideration as to what its future is. Of the 25 remaining sites, 21 of them comply with the Scottish Government's minimum standards, and all 25 comply with the fire safety requirements. So there is still work that needs to be done to make sure that they're all compliant and are up to standard, but I think that we are seeing some improvement from where we were. Michael, do you want to?
Yeah, it's probably worth highlighting that through our national report on the Charter, we've seen a fairly significant improvement in the satisfaction levels expressed by residents of Gypsy Traveller sites provided by social landlords, although those are still well below the kind of satisfaction levels that we're seeing for mainstream tenants. So there's still some way to go in that regard. As the committee may be aware, we've been asking for a fundamental review of the minimum site standards for some time now, and I'm Pleased to report that, again, as you are possibly aware, that the Scottish Government has now initiated a fundamental review of the site standards, and we'll participate fully in that review.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. I think that brings our questions to a close. Many thanks to you both for your evidence this morning. And as we previously agreed to take the next item of our agenda in private, that concludes the public part of our meeting, and we will move into private. Thank you very much.